Hello, friends. My name is Bill McKibben. I'm very sorry not to be with you in person, but very glad to be able to join you in this way, and so grateful for the chance to join virtually colleagues like Jim Hansen or Jamie Margolin, who are really important voices in all this work. At different ends of the age spectrum. Jim and I have been doing this for a very long time. That's why we're particularly glad to see younger people joining in. So let me do a few things here in my time with you. The first is to just try and set a little context for this problem. I wrote the first book about climate change. It came out in 1989 when I was in my 20s, so a long time ago. But we understood most of what we needed to know about the problem back then, thanks to great scientists like Dr. Hansen. We knew that when you burned coal and gas and oil, you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we knew that the molecular structure of CO2 traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. These are not controversial ideas. I'm sure that you've studied them all in physics and in chemistry. They're not controversial, they're just basic facts. And what they mean is that because we burn so much coal and gas and oil, we have altered the chemistry of the atmosphere of our planet. And now that atmosphere is getting hotter. Our Earth is heating up. So far, the Earth is about 1 degree centigrade or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than it was before we started burning all this stuff. That doesn't sound like so much, where I live today, it's 15 degrees outside right now. And if it was 16 degrees, I couldn't tell the difference. But the planet can tell the difference because aggregated over the huge scale of the Earth, it turns out to be a lot of heat. In fact, think about it in different units. Maybe you've seen pictures of the atomic explosion at Hiroshima and that huge mushroom cloud. Well, each day, because of that coal and gas and oil that we've burned, we trap the heat equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima-sized explosions. That big amount of heat explains why half the summer sea ice in the Arctic is gone and why Greenland and the Antarctic have begun to thaw very rapidly. And because warm air holds more water vapor than cold, you now know why we're seeing more evaporation and hence more drought and hence more forest fire in places like California or Australia or Siberia. These are not the kind of forest fires that plagued, say, Michigan 100 years ago, which were because of accidents with logging. These are because the temperature has changed very dramatically and it's gotten very hot and dry. Once that water is evaporated up into the atmosphere, it comes down, and it comes down in wet places, including places like the upper Midwest, which have seen big increases in the number of storms that drop a lot of rain at a time, the kind of storms that don't do anybody any good, that make farming harder, not easier. So we're in big trouble. And we're in bigger trouble yet because on the path we're currently taking, our kind of business as usual path, we will increase the temperature of the planet 3 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degrees Celsius, 6, 7 degrees Fahrenheit. If we do that, well, then we probably can't have civilizations like the ones we're used to. Too much disruption, too much chaos. We already see chaos because we, melt the Arctic. We're beginning to see weird things happening to the jet stream, and hence we get these huge cold snaps that go down to Texas and so on and so forth. We've got to stop that escalation up to 3 degrees. Our hope is that if we do a lot of things right now, we'll be able to hold the temperature increase to 2 degrees or maybe even less, 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if we can do that, it won't solve all our problems. It'll still be difficult, but we may make it through this as civilizations. So what do we need to do to make that happen? Basically, the answer is pretty simple. We need to stop burning coal and gas and oil, and we need to replace it with renewable energy, with solar power, with wind power, and with the batteries to store these things. And that's completely doable now. It's doable because engineers have done a good job. They've dropped the price of solar power and wind power 90% in the last decade. It's now the cheapest way to make electricity over most of the planet. And with all that cheap electricity, we can do remarkable things. You probably saw on the internet over the last couple of weeks the news that your home state company, General Motors, has decided to get out of the business of producing gas-powered cars. By 2035, everything that it makes is going to run on electricity. That's very good news because it means that each car won't be producing a little cloud of carbon dioxide as it makes its way down the street. Because we can hook up those cars to wind turbines and solar panels, we'll be able to drive cleanly. And we can do the same thing with buses and with trains. And we have e-bikes and e-scooters and all the other things that we need to get around. We can replace the gas stove at home with electric induction cooktops that work better. We can replace the gas and oil furnace in your house with air source heat pumps that run on electricity. These things are all important changes that are now pretty easy to make because we have these new technologies. So the question is, and here's the interesting question, we have a huge problem, the biggest problem humans have ever faced, one that might do us in. We have a solution to that problem. Why are we not pursuing that solution more aggressively? Why are we not moving more quickly? And the answer to that question is pretty simple. It's because the fossil fuel industry, the people who own oil wells and coal mines and so on, don't want us to. They want to keep their business model alive. And you all probably know enough about how our political systems work to know that if you have a lot of money, you're often able to prevent things change from happening in our political system. These companies we now know spent a lot of money trying to confuse people about climate change. They hired the same kind of propaganda experts who, in a previous generation, had tried to protect the cigarette companies from facing the facts about tobacco and cancer. Once they lost that fight, they moved on to working for the oil companies. And they're trying to delay action, and so far they've been pretty effective at it. That's why we need to build big movements. And that's why I started 15 years ago with 7 college students, this group called 350.org. It was the first iteration, the kind of beta test of a global climate movement. It took its strange name from what the scientists tell us is the most carbon we could safely have in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million. Sadly, we're already way past that. We're at about 415 parts per million. And that's why California keeps catching on fire, and why the sea level keeps rising. Too much carbon. 350, as I say, was the first iteration of this, but happily now there are many, many others who have joined in the fight. We've got groups like Extinction Rebellion in Europe that demonstrate in the streets. We've got the Sunrise Movement in our country, young people who are pushing for a Green New Deal. We've got the millions and millions and millions of high school and junior high school students around the world who have joined in organizations like Climate Strike and Fridays for the Future. Everybody's heard of Greta Thunberg in Sweden, and everybody should have heard of her. Greta is great. She's one of my favorite people. I love working with her. But I love even more the fact that there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs around the world, young people who have really taken this on, clearly some of them there in Battle Creek, and there are 10 million followers of those young people all over the world. And that's why we're beginning to see real change. That's why we've one of the reasons that we've gone from a world in which the President of the United States was telling us that climate change was a hoax to a world in which the new President of the United States is telling us that it's the biggest problem that we face and we've got to get around to doing something about it. So how do we help make that happen? And how can high school students in particular help make an impact? I think that young people actually are really doing the job now, that they're at the heart of the response to this crisis. And we need to keep doing what we're doing, which is building movements that put pressure on our political and economic systems. That's why it's so important to join with the groups that are doing things like, say, in Michigan, fighting Line 5 and oil pipelines under the Straits of Mackinac. That's been a huge victory. When Governor Whitmer said last year that there wouldn't be that they were going to shut down these pipelines. And good for her to do it. There's similar fights going on across the upper Midwest with things like the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota, or the Dakota Access pipeline in the Dakotas. And you'll note that it's not just young people, it's often indigenous people that are in the lead of these fights here because it's their land and the impacts are falling hardest on them. We need people standing up to the banks and other financial players that are helping fund the fossil fuel industry. That's why many of us have been campaigning against banks like, say, Chase Bank or Bank of America or Wells Fargo or Citibank, because they give huge amounts of money to the fossil fuel industry, allowing them to keep building new stuff when we need to be moving in the other direction. It's why we need to be in organizations that are helping push for more renewable energy across our states to make it easier to build solar panels and wind turbines, to demand that we increase the percentage of the power that comes from these things. These are all really important steps that groups ranging from 350 chapters across your area, to the Sierra Club, to the Sunrise Movement, to indigenous groups like Honor the Earth are taking. And I hope that you explore and join in with some of these efforts. Because if you do, you'll really be engaged in the most important work that's underway on the planet. And not many people get to say that. I've been very lucky. I've gotten to travel all over the world helping do this kind of organizing, because 350.org works in pretty much every country on earth except North Korea. And it's been really inspiring to get to see that there are people, especially young people, at the lead of all these fights everywhere. They're taking on big, powerful companies, and they're making real change. That's why General Motors is doing things differently. And that's why we have some hope. I've got to temper that hope by telling you that we need to move extremely fast. Climate change is a timed test. If we don't solve it soon, we will never solve it. And that's why it's different from other political issues. It's because, most things we can leave alone for a while and then get back to. But if we leave climate change alone, it gets worse. Nobody has a plan for how you freeze the Arctic again once it gets melted. So in the next decade, we've got enormous progress that we have to make. The scientists really tell us that the next decade is the last chance to make progress at the pace we need to. So I hope that many of you will get engaged in that process. And if you do, you'll make an extraordinary difference. I want to thank you for taking it seriously. And I want to say, as soon as we've all got our vaccinations, I look very much forward to seeing you in person on the front lines of these fights, wherever they are. Thank you very much for your good work.
And that is the end of the presentation that Bill McKibben sent to us. He also sent us some videos that he would recommend watching, just a couple short videos One's 7 minutes, one's 5 minutes. They're very short and they are well put together. So I will have Mr. Lewis go ahead and pull those up as well. And we should not have any problems this time around with it. So I hope you enjoy these. And after these, we can open up for any basic questions that you might have, because again, I am not Bill McKibben, so I cannot answer any questions about what he does. So I will hand it over to Mr. Lewis to go ahead and start up those videos.
The bullet train from New York to DC. It always brings me back to when I first started making this commute. In 2019, I was a freshman in the most diverse Congress in history. Up to that point, it was a critical time. I'll never forget the children in our community. They were so inspired to see this new class of politicians who reflected them, navigating the halls of power. It's often said, you can't be what you can't see. And for the first time, they saw themselves. I think there was something similar with the Green New Deal. We knew that we needed to save the planet and that we had all the technology to do it, but people were scared. They said it was too big, too fast, not practical. I think that's because they just couldn't picture it yet. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with how we got here. 1977, New York. A senior scientist named James Black made a presentation about how burning fossil fuels could eventually lead to global temperatures rising 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 2 years, one of the world's biggest supertankers was outfitted with a state-of-the-art lab to measure CO2 in the ocean, gathering more data about global warming. Guess who was doing all of this research? ExxonMobil, the oil and gas company. Oh yeah, Exxon knew this whole time, as did our politicians. 10 years later, James Hansen, NASA's top climate scientist, told Congress he was 99% certain that global warming was happening and caused by humans. That was 1988, the year before I was even born. So did Exxon listen to the science, including their own? Did they change business models, invest in renewables? No, the opposite. They knew and they doubled down. They and others spent millions setting up a network of lobby groups and think tanks to create doubt and denial about climate change. It was an effort designed to attack and dispute the very kind of science they themselves had been doing. And it worked. Politicians went to bat for fossil fuels, and these massive corporations kept digging and mining, drilling and fracking like there was no tomorrow. America became the biggest producer and consumer of oil in the world. Fossil fuel companies made hundreds of billions, while the public paid the lion's share to clean up their disasters. We lost a generation of time we'll never get back. Entire species will never get back. Natural wonders gone forever. And in 2017, Hurricane Maria destroyed the place where my family was from, Puerto Rico. It was like a climate bomb. It took as many American lives as 9/11. And in the next year, when I was elected to Congress, the world's leading climate scientists declared another emergency. They told us that we had 12 years left to cut our emissions in half, or hundreds of millions of people would be more likely to face food and water shortages, poverty, and death. 12 years to change everything. How we got around, how we fed ourselves, how we made our stuff, how we lived and worked, everything. The only way to do it was to transform our economy, which we already knew was broken, since the vast majority of wealth was going to just a small handful of people, and most folks were falling further and further behind. It was a true turning point. Lots of people gave up. They said we were doomed. But some of us remembered that as a nation, we'd been in peril before. The Great Depression, World War II. We knew from our history how to pull together to overcome impossible odds. And at the very least, we owed it to our children to try. The wave began when Democrats took back the House in 2018, and then the Senate and the White House in 2020, and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing for the fence ambition we needed. Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind. That included Medicare for All, the most popular social program in American history. We also introduced the federal jobs guarantee, a public option including dignified living wages for work. Funnily enough, the biggest problem in those early years was a labor shortage. We were building a national smart grid, retrofitting every building in America, putting trains like this one all across the country. We needed more workers. That group of kids from my neighborhood were right in the middle of it all, especially this one girl, Ileana. Her first job out of college was with AmeriCorps Climate, restoring wetlands and bayous in coastal Louisiana. Most of her friends were in her union, including some oil workers in transition. They took apart old pipelines and got to work planting mangroves with the same salary and benefits. Of course, when it came to healing the land, we had huge gaps in our knowledge. Luckily, Indigenous communities offered generational expertise to help guide the way. Ileana got restless, tried her hand as a solar plant engineer for a while, but eventually made her career in raising the next generation as part of the Universal Child Care Initiative. As it turns out, caring for others is valuable, low-carbon work, and we started paying real money to folks like teachers, domestic workers, and home health aides. Those were years of massive change, and not all of it was good. When Hurricane Sheldon hit southern Florida, parts of Miami went underwater for the last time. But as we battled the floods, fires, and droughts, we knew how lucky we were to have started acting when we did. And we didn't just change the infrastructure, we changed how we did things. We became a society that was not only modern and wealthy, but dignified and humane too. By committing to universal rights like healthcare and meaningful work for all, we stopped being so scared of the future. We stopped being scared of each other, and we found our shared purpose. Ileana heard the call too, and in 2028, she ran for office in the first cycle of publicly funded election campaigns. And now she occupies the seat that I once held. I couldn't be more proud of her, a true child of the Green New Deal. When I think back to my first term in Congress, riding that old school Amtrak in 2019, all of this was still ahead of us. And the first big step was just closing our eyes and imagining it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see.
Looking back, it's hard to believe that we've rebuilt our community from the ground up with our own hands. The first seeds were planted way back in the terror and tenderness of the pandemic. And then change bloomed in the streets, in the fire and struggle of the uprisings. Around here, we'll never forget the day that the last prisoners were released, walking out into the arms of their loved ones. The easy part was finding work. The Community Care Corps was always looking for people in those days, whether for universal family care, burying border walls, or green new public housing, going up one pod at a time. Yep, it was a good time for busy hands.
Funny, thinking back to the first wave of the pandemic, that's what you really remember. Hands. Washing, scrubbing, disinfecting, washing again, picturing each other's hands, all the hands that had touched whatever we were touching, the hands that packed the box, that picked the tomato, that planted the seed, the hands that stroked the brow, that said goodbye. The hands were us, all of us. That web of hand to hand, breath to breath relationships was a reminder. We are all entangled. making each other sick, keeping each other alive. That was just one of the lessons of COVID-19. It started in the first great pause, when the smog cleared and the rich fled the cities, when poverty dropped its disguise and racist inequality drew the map of the disease. As the roar of the traffic faded, we arose to birdsong and ambulance sirens. The virus showed us what was truly essential. And we learned again and again that so many of us doing essential work were being treated as sacrificial. From nursing homes to detention facilities, meatpacking plants, and fulfillment centers, the virus exposed the cruelty of these warehouses of efficiency and profit. Then things got worse. In 2023, super droughts led to mega floods. Locusts carved a path across continents and hyper typhoons drove millions from their homes. COVID-23 raced through storm shelters and refugee camps. Supplies ran out again. Meanwhile, dinosaurs roamed the halls of power, bellowing that more sacrifice was needed. But every time they cranked up that rusty old machine called economic growth, the cloud of sickness and death grew.
And we couldn't breathe. Couldn't breathe from the asthma in our polluted communities, from the smoke of those fires. We couldn't breathe with a knee on our necks, in the clouds of tear gas as we shouted, "Black Lives Matter." And that is how the virus changed everything. We finally understood that we couldn't keep patching up the same broken systems. We had to build something new. What was needed was a spark. That spark was us. After months of organizing, the viral rent strike was like a starting gun. Then came the essential workers' strike. Delivery drivers, street cleaners, and farm workers got together and said, enough. This time, people didn't just clap from their balconies. We flooded into the streets to join together. One of the leaders was Luciela, a young food courier. When a police bullet stole her life, the crowds exploded in size and then exploded again, spreading across borders like a counter-virus. The sparks look different in every country as the wildfire strikes leapt across borders. Economies ground to a halt, this time blockaded by workers. We lost too many young heroes as states brought out the iron fist, but it was no match for the raised fist of solidarity. Soon, authoritarian rulers started to topple like statues, and new governments were suddenly nervous about ignoring the streets. We joined hands and pushed further, launching the years of repair.
The first step was rebuilding the economy around the core of essential work: food and farming, care for young and old, public health. Not to mention the essential labor of the more than human world, the winged pollinators, the leafy oxygen makers. The Full Employment Act made the new priorities clear, and there was a wave of new worker cooperatives in everything from mental health support to public art and tree planting. Many bosses were made redundant. Our information ecology needed tending too, and so we built a digital commons, vaccinated it against surveillance, and built up our herd immunity to disinformation. Fossil fuels were running on fumes by that point, so we harnessed their final profits to clean up their messes. Whatever we could, we did outdoors. School, theatre, celebrating. At first because it was safer, then because we realised it made us happier. Nobody talked about missing shopping. Anyway, the right to repair movement meant that a lot of stuff got fixed rather than thrown away and replaced. With life moving at a slower pace, we finally had time to look back, and we began the most important repair of all, repairing relationships. In colonial countries like the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK, those were hard conversations. But truth and reparations commissions helped some of us face the truth about the violent conquests of the past and how they shaped our world. That guided where we repaired and how. It turned out that once we fully funded schools and housing and healthcare, we didn't need those bloated budgets for policing, prisons, and war. And ultimately, the flow of money on planet Earth had to be reversed. So the North finally started paying its debts, and the South finally stopped.
Around here, the Land Back program began the historic process of returning some of the stolen land to indigenous jurisdiction. In the process, we remembered how taking care of the earth lays the ground for taking care of each other. Within just a few years, we could see the bottom of the river again, and it was safe to drink and fish in its waters. Things aren't perfect, of course. Between mutating viruses and our warming world, there's always new storms headed our way. But when they come, we're ready. With our networks of nurses and neighbors, our small farms and big forests, our systems of care and repair, no one is sacrificed. Everyone is essential.